Which leads me now to the topic for tonight's lecture, industrial strategy, a productive economy and good secure jobs. Jeremy is committed to an industrial strategy, investing in research and development, better training, ending zero-hour contracts, providing safe working conditions. Not a recent convert to these ideals and principles, but someone with a long track record of support. So let's hear it from him. Brothers, sisters, comrades, friends, boys and girls, tonight I want to introduce you to the twice elected leader of the Labour Party on a massive mandate for change. Welcome to Govan, Jeremy Corbyn.
Friends, thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. And Lynn, thank you for what you just said. First of all, I absolutely join with you in sending our very, very best wishes of strength and solidarity to our good friend Mark Sawatka. He is waiting in hospital for a heart transplant. He, as he describes to me, has been carrying his heart round on his hip for a couple of years now. Wherever you go to a meeting, he says, "Don't brush against me, it'll stop my heart." And what a brave man, what a wonderful leader of a trade union, what a great friend to all of us. Can we just send him a round of applause? And in case you hadn't realised it, there's a sort of NUPE unison connection going on here, because my good friend Bob Thompson, who's put so much effort into the Jimmy Reid Foundation, he and I were colleagues in the National Union of Public Employees from the 1970s onwards, and we've remained good friends ever since then. I really admire Bob's work. And our Shadow Secretary of State, Dave Anderson, who's also here tonight. Thank you, Dave, for coming along. You're absolutely welcome. Dave was a member of NUPE and later on became president of my union, Unison, the union that we're all in. So that is a good connection there. And I also want to say thank you to Jimmy Reid's family for coming along this evening and allowing us to share the memories of Jimmy, but also the political inspiration that he was. Because it's things like the foundation that are actually very, very important. And so at the end of this event, if you're not already a paid-up and signed supporter or a member of the Federation, please join it, because it's important to have that space on the left, that there can be debate and discussion. You can hear points of view put forward and develop them from it. Some people say to me, well, you should never go around preaching to the converted, and this is very appropriate in a church, and Tony Benn always said this to me. He said, if the church didn't go around preaching to the converted would soon become the unconverted. You've got to keep in touch with them all the time. And this building is very, very beautiful and very, very special. I came here a few weeks ago during the leadership campaign to recce the building and got a lovely tour of the building from the volunteers that help keep it alive as a community centre and keep the history of it alive. So thank you very much to them. Ian Davidson drove me up here. I had a good look at it, and I think it's a wonderful building. The ancient stones are remarkable and beautiful. And what's also nice is the space here for the Russian Orthodox community in Glasgow to have some space for worship. There has to be space for every community in every city. That is what a cohesive society and cohesive city is all about. And I wish the Tory party would begin to understand that. I first got to know of and about Jimmy Reid in the time of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders work in, because I was then, as now, politically very active and obviously followed what was going on. And at that time I was working in the Tailors and Garment Workers Union and then the Engineering Union, where Jimmy Ellie and Jimmy were, of course, members of the union. And the incredible turn of phrase that Jimmy had during so many of his contributions. And I thought the wonderful one was when he was questioned about whether or not people should read Oz magazine and should they be tolerant of it. He said he didn't particularly care, but he was appalled of a society that would be tolerant of poverty, tolerant of unemployment, tolerant of misery, and tolerant of destitution. He said that's where our intolerance should take over, not worrying about the so-called moral values of magazines or otherwise. His political views were that of a dedicated socialist all his life, the most brilliant orator I ever heard. I did hear him speak on a number of occasions, absolutely astonishing. And where did his learning come from? The public library, because Jimmy was a great advocate of public libraries and public education and learnt a lot in a self-taught way, and I've got such empathy with that. And when he started the work-in, amongst the many strictures he put on people as to how it was going to be conducted, he went on to say, and there would be no bevying whatsoever in the work-in. It would be a disciplined, organised event. Tony Benn told me he absolutely admired that particular phrase, loved that, and told me at great length what a wonderful man Jimmy Reid was, because he didn't allow any bevying to take place, because Tony Benn was, if nothing else, a wonderful socialist, but also a very, very dedicated teetotaler, as we all know, and he drank prodigious cups of tea to prove he was a teetotaler. Now, 45 years later, we are talking about many of the issues that might be described as the same, but in reality, there are very important differences. The sameness are the values, the sameness is the solidarity, the sameness is the understanding of community and what people want. So I stand here today saying to you there is a different way, a better way of organising our economy that could create decent, well-paid jobs and that will improve the living standards of everyone in this country. We're offering an alternative, a different way of doing things, where you ignore nobody, you forget nobody, you build a sense of inclusion, of decency and moral respect within our society. Now, that might sound like simple words, but just think about it. Is it right that we tolerate seeing people begging on the street, seeing people bedding down for the night outside train stations or looking for shop windows, doorways in order to spend the night? No, it's of course morally wrong. It's also totally unnecessary. Our country is quite wealthy enough to afford housing for everybody and ensure nobody is completely destitute if we had the political will to conquer that destitution. So we need to challenge not just austerity that is now being imposed upon us, but the failed economic model that has undermined our treasured public services, creating a more unequal and more brutal society. Too many people in too many parts of our country have been excluded from the prosperity that a small number enjoy. Inequality has disfigured our society. Over the past 30 years, there's been a flawed consensus that is submitted to market rules rather than those of democratic government. I intend to challenge that consensus and to redistribute wealth and power, to transform our society so that no one and nowhere is left behind. I understand and fully support devolution. It's deepened our democracy. It's absolutely right that the responsibilities and powers to take decision about Scotland's future should lie with the Scottish people and the Scottish Parliament. I've laid out an ambitious programme for democratic reform across the whole of the UK. And since I believe that we can achieve much more once ordinary people are given an effective voice. It's Labour's commitment to making the difference that means we're not looking for alliances with other people. I welcome the support for any of our policies from other political parties or groups. I'm always happy to work with them where one can get agreement and where change can be brought about. But fundamentally, Labour's purpose has always been to shift the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people. And under this leadership, this party is committed to turning that into a reality. Other parties have a different purpose. The SNP to achieve independence. I reserve the right to disagree with it and judge as the majority of Scots did in 2014. But there are economic issues that have to be faced. A government deficit of nearly 15 billion presents a huge question mark over the central economic strategy that's on offer. A Labour government will demonstrate to the Scottish people that it's Labour which has the answers to the deep unfairness and inequalities that currently stain our country. Our programme for the UK, obviously including Scotland, chimes with that of the Scottish Labour Party and the manifesto that's been put forward. Now, Jimmy, in his time, was setting out an alternative to the economic strategy of neoliberalism. The early 1970s were extremely turbulent times. Inflation was soaring, unemployment was rising, and there was growing industrial unrest. Capitalism and the growth of economies in Western Europe and the USA ever since the end of the Second World War was in crisis, and the post-war Keynesian consensus was breaking down. The Tories won the 1970 election, and Edward Heath, the then Prime Minister, seized the crisis as an opportunity to enforce harsh medicine of market liberalisation and tougher trade union laws. His was the first big breach with the post-war consensus. Thatcher came later and was even worse. But the early 1970s also saw a resurgent left, both intellectually and politically, resulting in inspiring industrial disputes. Perhaps most famously was the successful Upper Clyde shipbuilders' work-in of 1971, led by Jimmy Reid and Jimmy Airlie. By demonstrating the capacity of an organised workforce to bypass the employers, the action absolutely electrified the labour movement. It seemed that the traditional capitalist order was vulnerable. And looking back at that time, it was quite amazing to understand what was going on there. And that inspired a lot of other political and industrial activity all over the country. The Labour left was inspired by these successes, and Tony Benn's very close involvement in the UCS work-in from the Labour front bench in Parliament gave that sense that the old order was breaking down and led to Labour's alternative economic strategy, a very bold attempt to move away from the old economic orthodoxy. I feel the same debate is happening at this very same time when John McDonnell tries to bring about a new economic strategy, which is only slowly being understood by many of the financial papers in this country. But the influence of Upper Clyde, the influence of the alternative economic strategy, had an enormous effect on the trade unions and the Labour Party. In 1973, Labour Party conference passed a number of very strong motions on public ownership, on redistribution of wealth and power, and this was reflected in the election addresses or election manifestos of both the 1974 elections in February and October. Put it into context. The fight with the miners the then Tory government was having was one that was brutal and bitter. What they did was essentially a lockout of most of the industrial workers of this country by imposing a 3-day week. Imposing a 3-day week, believing that somehow or other people would be frightened by all this and would re-elect a Tory government, and calling a snap election. They assumed they were going to win it. They didn't. The February 1974 election was bitterly fought, was a very close result, and what came from that was a minority Labour government. And then October of that year, 8 months later, that government was re-elected with a small majority. And during the intervening time, the then Labour government had settled the issue with the miners, repealed the Industrial Relations Act, which had led to the imprisonment of trade unionists and the sequestration of funds of trade unions, and brought in the Health, Safety and Welfare at Work Act as a precursor of what its industrial strategy was going to be. Those were indeed heady days. The AES sought to stimulate investment, encourage exports, create employment, protect workers and consumers from irresponsible multinational companies, and to plan the national economy in the national interest. I got to know Tony Benn very well during that period because I was working with him and many others on the industrial strategy of the government. And even then, this was in the 1970s, he was saying that to be successful, a government has to act internationally in order to control the way in which global corporations can play ducks and drakes with national economies and individual governments. That government ran into trouble, and in 1976, the International Monetary Fund crisis came upon them. Interestingly, within the Labour cabinet at that time, Tony Benn and Anthony Crosland, from opposite wings of the Labour Party, both opposed the IMF loan because of the conditions attached to it, which were a breach of the social contract and the start of public spending cuts. And it saw an intensifying of that conflict within the movement. Successive Tory governments have seized on that as an example to try and say the only way forward is to deregulate the economy and leave the market to its own devices. It's a logic that accepted the fading of our industrial heartlands on the basis that a market-led expansion of services, and particularly financial services, was more efficient. What that government was trying to do, what Ben particularly was trying to do then, was to invest in manufacturing industry and invest in new technology and frontier technology, not so that fewer people could work, but so that the wealth generated by new high technology could be shared and spread amongst everybody else. Exactly the same arguments apply today. But it was not to be. That government was defeated in 1979, and Margaret Thatcher came to power with the immortal words of Tina, "There is no alternative." But of course that was a lie. The market triumphalism of that time has blighted our communities for more than 3 decades and was a political choice. The destruction of the steel industry, the privatisation of most of the public services and publicly owned industries at that time, including shipbuilding, which was nationalised by the Labour government in the 70s and privatised by the Tories, was a political choice which has damaged the industrial base of this country ever since. Like it or not, neoliberalism has dominated and restructured our economy ever since then. And we saw the long-term results of that in 2008, when the economy collapsed because of the banking crisis, when reckless, overgrown financial sector drove our economy right to the very edge. And what's followed since then has been 6.5 years of ideologically driven austerity. Austerity which is cutting public expenditure, particularly that in Department of Work and Pensions, and particularly in local government. But has the austerity actually produced the results it claimed it would? Has it paid off the debt? Has it paid off the deficit? Has it given a rebirth to manufacturing industry? No. The Tories have missed every single economic target they set themselves, and it's the poorest and working people that have suffered the most. 84% of cuts have fallen disproportionately on women. The poorest areas of the country have suffered the most and continue to do so. So there is a challenge for us here, a challenge for the left in society, to understand how we got to the situation we're in and how we replace it with a new, more progressive social and economic model. So I stand here on an unashamedly anti-austerity platform of policies that will ensure no one across Scotland or the rest of the country is left behind. John McDonnell put this very well at the Labour conference in 2015, just after he'd been appointed, when he said, let's be honest about it, austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity. He was castigated for it at the time, and yet 6 months, 9 months later, every responsible, serious commentator on economic affairs says, well, yes, it is a political choice. It is a political choice that you either cut public expenditure, diminish the life chances, particularly of the poorest in society, or do you invest? And I would say that the contribution made by that simple statement of John and the way in which the Labour Party is now stuck to an anti-austerity position has fundamentally changed the terms of economic thinking and economic debate in this country. So let's fight in the next election on the basis of who's going to invest in the economy, who's going to grow the economy to share it out for the good of all, not grow the economy to deepen the inequality within our societies. So the plans include progressive taxation policies to tackle the scandalously aggressive and systematic tax avoidance and tax evasion that exists and scars this country, and to grow our economy and increase tax receipts that will close the deficit created and help provide the resources that Scotland and the rest of the country needs it. So we're proposing a £500 billion investment commitment, which would give £23 billion investment in Scotland, doubling the current level investment over a decade. And that will create good, secure jobs across the economy, backed up by an industrial strategy that supports those areas that we know the future potential is there, like renewables and advanced manufacturing. Bringing forward some of that investment will help stabilise the economy during the period of uncertainty after Brexit. We're also pledged to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy and drive the expansion of green industries and green jobs for the future. The Scottish National Bank will help provide the means to drive that expansion. We will expand community renewables and build democratic control into our energy sector. And indeed, we launched an energy policy document in Nottingham during my leadership election campaign, which was about empowering local authorities all over the UK to develop their own power generation systems as a way of giving a more reliable and more diverse source of power. It's also about promoting public ownership and control of our energy alongside the vision of those that helped create the publicly owned North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board to harness the natural resources in Scotland. The investment commitment a Labour government will make will ensure that every single family has a decent and secure home. We are in the midst of a housing crisis all over the country, where there are increasing numbers of homeless people who are rough sleeping. There's a terrifying increase in overcrowding, and there's an increase in ill health, particularly amongst children in overcrowded accommodation. There is also an expenditure now across the whole of the UK of £9.5 billion a year in subsidising private sector rents through the housing benefit system. Quite simply, if we invested in council housing with permanent tenancies, secure tenancies on reasonable rents, you actually create a virtuous circle of good housing, jobs in the construction industry, jobs in the supply chain, and public money being used to invest in bricks and mortar rather than subsidising the private rented market in housing. And so to do this, we would create a Scottish National Bank under local control, backed by a National Investment Bank, with 20 billion of lending power to deliver the funds to local projects and in Scotland's small businesses. Just 8% of lending to small businesses in the UK goes to Scotland at the present time, compared to 1/3 which goes to London and the South East. The Scottish National Bank would help to address the imbalance and unlock the potential of the small businesses. Austerity was always a political choice, not an economic necessity. The Conservative targets for government debt, the government deficit, were always determined by their political choice, not by the needs of the economy. By enforcing austerity, they've helped undermine wages and left our economy and society weaker. Their fiscal policy is now entirely discredited. Real wage rates have fallen, particularly in the public sector, but also in a lot of private sector. There is also more and more insecure employment, and there's greater salary and wage imbalance in most of our big corporations between those at the top and those that are doing the work on the call centre, the offices, or the shop floor. So our alternative would instead make sure the proceeds of growth are more fairly redistributed. So we'll have a fiscal credibility rule, which means that we commit to ending austerity across the whole of the UK and developing that investment. So we will end the cheapskate economy, where millions are pushed into low-paid, insecure jobs. By restoring lost workplace rights, we'll make sure that those in work have the ability to speak out and win a fair share of our prosperity. And by delivering the investment this whole economy needs, backed up by an industrial strategy, we will create decent, secure, well-paid jobs. If you look at the history of inequality on both sides of the Atlantic, there's quite an interesting statistic that emerges. Where there is a high level of trade union organisation, where there is efficient and effective trade unionism, what happens is the companies are often more efficient, the wages are better paid, the inequality is less, and the productivity is much higher. And so the idea that a deregulated anti-trade union economy is somehow or other something that is to be sought actually turns out to be the very opposite of what is needed. If you look at the USA, where trade union membership was relatively high in the 40s and 50s and has fallen a great deal since then, inequality has risen a great deal. So I would say, on passing, that well done to the SIEU union in the USA for mounting its $15 an hour basic wage campaign, winning real pay rises for 20 million workers in the last 6 months by getting that minimum wage through. And so our government would also seek to support and sustain an increase in investment in public services. But it's not just about investing in public services, it's also about the democratic control we want over them. So we want to support co-ops, want to support workplace organisation and bring under local public control, particularly services like buses, and under regional control services like railways. After all, we invest in the infrastructure of the railways. We buy the rolling stock for the railways. Yet, somehow or other, we manage not to get the benefits from the train operating companies. There's something missing there. Isn't it time all of them were publicly owned and brought under public control? But railways alone are not the only form of public transport. In fact, for many communities, a bus service is actually more important than a railway service. And so, across the whole of the UK, we've seen a diminution of bus services and catastrophic damage to rural economies, which end up often very isolated because there is no public transport. Where's investment in good communications, railways, buses, broadband, and so on, you do get quite a big economic boost for it, particularly in areas that are isolated and often very poor. So it's also a question of supporting what councils and councillors do, because a local authority, at one level, is an elected forum for people to be represented, obviously to administer local services. The majority of their funding comes from central government, or in the case of Scotland, from the Scottish Government. They are bearing the brunt of the cuts all over the UK. The biggest cuts are taking place in local government expenditure, where local authorities end up, in effect, being the conduit for passing on central government cuts. I see local authorities as, at their best, an opportunity for development, an opportunity for innovative ideas and the running of public services, and above all, a wonderful way in dealing with the housing crisis by giving local authorities the power and the responsibility to build the houses that we need. But it does mean also recognising that public sector workers are absolutely essential and vital to do that, because austerity has decimated local government. The outcome of all this in Scotland is that 30,000 fewer Scottish local government workers, with many, many more jobs under threat as the financial squeeze continues to bite. Unison in Scotland have done valuable, important work and showing what this means. Fewer workers doing more work for less pay. In reality, many people who work for the health service and local government actually do a great deal of work free, unpaid, way beyond the hours they're paid for, because they care so much about the communities that they look after and the people that they look after. So I think it's important that we recognise that. And so I want to enable local councils to bring services like buses under public control and ensure the trains, as I've indicated, are publicly owned. It's also important to look at the issues of education. In the speech I made to the Labour Party conference last week, I committed us to a national education service that will deliver the best possible education from the youngest to the oldest in our society, on the same principle that we want a national health service that provides good quality health care from cradle to grave. Because what we've done in Britain has seen a gradual diminution of the idea of the education service as a right for all of us. It's become commercialised preschool, it's become commercialised at college and a university level. Consequently, not all our children get good preschool facilities. Not all our young people get to go to college or to go to university. And so I think we have to change our thought process and say two things. One is, education is a wonderful prize for all of us, an opportunity for all of us to develop, whoever we are, whatever our abilities, whatever our background. And if you have a well-educated, well-trained society, we all benefit. If somebody becomes a good engineer, our trains are safer, our cars are safer, our buses are safer. All that actually adds up to a community benefit for all. Many countries in the world don't charge for university education, don't see it as something that should be set out to the market. They see it as a public good for all of us. I want us to return to that principle. What I also want to do is ensure that our education is in all aspects of it. Because, yes, obviously the skill sets necessary to be taught in school are very important. The traditional academic subjects are absolutely vital. I fully understand all that. But what I also think is, it's unlocking people's creative imagination and ability, giving everyone access to the wonderful cultural heritage we all have and enjoy, which is why I've proposed within the National Education Service that we have a pupil premium for arts and music, so that every child can get access to good quality music education. Every child can enjoy the arts that we also all enjoy. And so we're proposing to develop that. But it's also important to invest in further education, because too many college places have been lost in Scotland, and too many college places, particularly for women, have been lost, and Audit Scotland have pointed that out. So it is a question of ensuring our colleges remain local, our colleges remain diverse, and our colleges offer a full range of courses. But it's also a question of how we deal with apprenticeships and the quality of them. There are some absolutely brilliant apprentice schemes, no question about that, absolutely superb. There are also some that are little more than exploited cheap labour on a very low rate of pay. They're not really being trained very much, they're just exploited young workers. I want to do two things: end the youth rate on the minimum wage, but also pay a proper rate to apprenticeships and have proper, tough monitoring of all apprenticeships to make sure those that are doing them do get good qualifications and do get properly trained in the meantime. And so I admire the work that's been done by Scottish activists in the STUC Women's Committee who've campaigned for free universal childcare. So I want to see that investment across the whole of the country. It's ensuring that workers do have proper rights. So we want to create something much better at the workplace, and trade unions having a proper role in all of this, particularly in training and the issues surrounding that. And what we've done as a party is launched Workplace 2020, which is a conversation with unions, with people who are self-employed, with small businesses, with other businesses, on what rights we want to bring in at the workplace when we have the opportunity to do it. I think it's extremely important that we do that, because I don't believe we should shy away from the need to bring in proper rights at work and end the way in which this country's legislation is actually out with even the International Labour Organisation conventions. But along with rights at work and rights to housing and rights to all the issues we've talked about, I think we also have to look at the issue of human rights within our society. I can't be the only person who this week was quite disgusted when Conservative Party leaders sank to a new low when they fanned the flames of xenophobia and hatred in our communities of trying to blame foreign workers for their own failures. We need to do better than that. Drawing out lists of foreign workers won't stop unscrupulous employers undercutting wages in Britain. Shutting the door to international students won't pay young people's tuition fee debts. Ditching doctors from abroad won't cut National Health Service waiting lists. The Conservatives will instead foster division and discrimination in our workplaces and communities. Instead of turning people against each other, ministers should take action now to deal with the real impact of immigration. They should stop the abuse of migrant labour, used to undercut pay and conditions, which would in itself reduce numbers if that ended, and sign the Posting of Workers Directive, which would prevent unscrupulous employers bringing groups of workers in specifically to undercut and destroy local working conditions. They should be supporting communities with the investment they need in any shortages they have in housing, in education or in healthcare, and set out fair rules on how we deal with this. What I've done is try to set out a programme that would, I believe, make a big transformation in Scotland, but also in the rest of the UK. But it's about changing how our economic model operates that is so important if we're to transform society. Because it is about the neoliberal model that we've inherited ever since the 1970s. I remember a time in the 1970s when, as a union organiser, somebody asked me a question. It was one of those seminal moments at a union branch meeting. They said, "What do you think about privatisation?" It was a word I'd hardly ever heard before until the 1970s. And suddenly you hear it all the time. And the branch meeting discussed it, and we concluded that it didn't sound like a very good idea. And it still isn't. And so we passed a motion against it, as you do. But we also have grown up with the good notion that each generation should bequeath something to the next generation, that we should bequeath to our children a good health service, a good education service, somewhere decent to live, and a reliable pension at the end of your life. There should be an improvement in each generation's living standards compared to those that went before. And for most of the industrial world, particularly in Europe and North America, that was the norm until not so long ago. The neoliberal idea is to roll back the role of the state, of the community, of government, of public services, and make sure the individual has to make their own provision for the future. That's why the argument about the National Health Service is so central to everything that we believe in. It's absolutely central to it. Do we have an NHS free at the point of use for all people, for all time, or do we allow it to be reduced, diminished, rationed, contracted, so that it becomes a health service of last resort rather than first port of call for all of us? It's a very fundamental issue for the Labour movement. So it's also about our confidence. And this is where, in a sense, the parallel with what happened in 1970, 71, 72 during the Upper Clyde work-in. That was about confidence, the confidence of a community to say, they will not close our shipyard, they will not destroy our industry, because it is we who built the industry in the first place. It is we who made the work that built the ships, that built the yard, that built the profits that go with it. So it's about our confidence. Do we allow our society to be divided by greed and xenophobia, or do we instead say we'll be united as communities to create a better society here? A better society on housing, better society on education, and invest in industrial development for all of us, and reduce the appalling levels of inequality that exist within our society. It's also about the contribution we make wider than that on human rights and peace and justice. Because We work, yes, at one level for ourselves, but we also work for the wider community and what we want to come after us. And I thought when Jimmy Reid spoke at his wonderful address at becoming the rector of Glasgow University, he said a couple of things that were quite brilliant in that speech. I'm convinced that the great mass of our people go through life without even a glimmer of what they've contributed to their fellow human beings. This is a personal tragedy. It's a social crime. The flowering of each individual's personality and talents is the precondition for everyone's development. Jimmy said, each one of us contributes to the good of all of us. And in conclusion of his wonderful address there, he quoted from Burns, "The golden age will then revive. Each man shall be a brother. In harmony we shall all live until the earth together. In virtue trained, enlightened youth shall move each fellow creature, and time shall surely prove the truth that man is good by nature." Jimmy summed up his socialism as the equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount, and since we're speaking in a church, that's obviously entirely appropriate. When we approach the great economic questions, it is about mobilising all of us, but it is also deciding what an economy is for. Is it for a minority to make themselves extremely wealthy up here, or is it to create something good and sustainable for this generation, for the next generation, and the generations that come, and contribute as best we can to a world of peace and justice of human rights? That is what my ideas of socialism are about. That is what I believe, actually, the vast majority of people's normal human instincts are actually about. We remember Jimmy for what he did, what he said, and the way he said it. But we remember him to learn from him to ensure that we do develop an economy of the future that really does work for the good of all, and we leave the inequalities, the misery, and the poverty far behind. Thank you very much.